In the spring of 1992, in a boardroom somewhere in the southeast of England, a set of documents was signed that ended 68 years of British ownership of a loudspeaker company based in Ipswich, Suffolk. The buyer was Kenergetics Holdings, a holding company whose majority shareholder was Gold Peak Industries of Hong Kong. The transaction was unremarkable by the standards of early 1990s corporate consolidation. A British manufacturer changing hands. It happened every week. What made it different was what the company made. At the moment those documents were signed, Celestion speakers were loaded inside the amplifiers of virtually every significant rock band performing on Earth. They were in the Vox AC30 combos at the back of stages from Tokyo to Los Angeles. They were in the Marshall 4x12 cabinets stacked behind guitarists whose names filled arenas. They were in the studio monitors of recording engineers who had spent their careers chasing a specific frequency. A warmth in the mid-range, a compression at the top end, a quality of breakup when the amp was pushed that no other speaker had quite managed to replicate. The musicians knew the amplifier brands, they knew the valve types, they knew the cabinet dimensions. Almost none of them knew the name Celestion. How many times have you heard the sound of Celestion and never once heard the name? That is the question this story answers. Because the real story of Celestion is not the 1992 sale, though that sale matters. It is not the factory that closed. It is not the housing estate that replaced it. The real story begins in a small factory beside the Thames in Surrey in the winter of 1959, when a British engineer named Les Ward made 3 small modifications to a radio speaker, and in doing so, accidentally defined the sound of the 20th century. If you've ever wondered why British amplifiers sound the way they do, why there's something in the mid-range of a Vox or a Marshall that no amount of modern engineering has fully explained, this channel is where those answers live. Subscribe and stay with us. Hampton Wick is a small riverside settlement on the southwestern edge of London, separated from the Surrey town of Kingston-upon-Thames by a bridge and a few hundred yards of the Thames. In 1924, it was the kind of place where a man with a workshop and a practical turn of mind could start something quietly and see where it led. Cyril French had exactly that combination. He and his brothers had taken over a plating works, a small industrial unit used for electroplating metal components, and were listed in the trade directories of the period as electrical instrument manufacturers. The description was accurate, if modest. What they were actually doing was helping a Scottish inventor named Eric Mackintosh turn a patent into a product. Mackintosh had filed British patent number 230052 in December 1923. It described a loudspeaker, one of the earliest cone loudspeakers of its kind, using a bamboo-reinforced diaphragm and a moving armature design that Mackintosh called a free vibrating edge. The BBC had begun broadcasting in November 1922. Britain was discovering radio, and radio required a way to fill a room with sound. The gramophone horn was the existing solution. It was large, directional, and belonged to a different era. The cone loudspeaker was something else entirely. A flat disc of treated paper that moved air in response to electrical signal, quietly and in every direction at once. In 1924, that was close to magic. French and Mackintosh applied for a joint patent, built a prototype, and launched the product the following year. The Celestion loudspeaker went on sale in early 1925 at a retail price of £6.10, roughly a week's wages for a skilled factory worker in Surrey at the time. It was available in a choice of cabinets: oak, walnut, or mahogany. The trade magazine Popular Wireless reviewed it that year and described it as a top-class instrument capable of providing high-quality performance. For a product that had existed for less than 12 months, that was not a modest reception. The company grew through the late 1920s. By 1929, the operation had outgrown Hampton Wick and moved to larger premises at 145 London Road, Kingston-upon-Thames. Celestion Limited was formally registered in 1928, and the company's motto, "The very soul of music," dated from this period. It was an ambitious phrase for a manufacturer of radio accessories. It turned out to be an accurate one. The Depression of the mid-1930s hit hard. Cyril French and Eric McIntosh both departed the company they had founded, leaving it to navigate the contraction without them. What sustained Celestion through that period was not any single product, but the basic structural fact of its position. Britain needed loudspeakers, and Celestion made them. The radio market did not disappear in a recession. It contracted, and then it grew again. By the time the Second World War began, Celestion was producing military specification speakers, band repeaters for Royal Navy warships, components for anti-aircraft warning systems, alongside its civilian lines. The post-war consolidation came quickly. In July 1946, British Rolla, the British subsidiary of the American Rolla Company of Cleveland, Ohio, which had been manufacturing speakers at its Ferry Works factory on Summer Road, Thames Ditton, Surrey, acquired Celestion outright. The logic was straightforward. British Rolla and Celestion together covered practically the entire British loudspeaker export trade. Combining them eliminated a competitor and doubled the export capacity in a single transaction. 2 years later, in July 1948, Celestion's production machinery and personnel moved from Kingston upon Thames to the Ferry Works at Thames Ditton. The company title became Rolla Celestion Limited. The brand name, Celestion, was registered as the trademark for all products. The Kingston factory went quiet. In 1949, a further acquisition brought Rolla Celestion under the ownership of Truvox, a North London company specializing in public address loudspeakers and systems. The addition of PA capability expanded the product range without disrupting the core manufacturing base at Thames Ditton. What Truvox brought to the relationship, beyond its PA portfolio, was stability, capital, and a management structure suited to the scale that the 1950s were about to demand. Because the 1950s demanded an enormous amount. The stereophonic long-playing record arrived. Broadcast television expanded across Britain. Every television set required a loudspeaker. Every radio receiver required a loudspeaker. Every public address system, every cinema, every dance hall required loudspeakers in numbers and at tolerances that made the pre-war market look like a rehearsal. By the mid-1950s, Celestion had 400 employees at the Thames Ditton factory and was producing between 30,000 and 35,000 speaker units every week. Industry estimates of the period suggested that approximately half of the radios in the United Kingdom contained a Rolla Celestion speaker inside. The company had 485 employees on its books by 1961, half of Britain's radios. Every week, 30,000 units, in a factory beside a river in Surrey. That is the company that Les Ward joined as chief engineer. And in 1959, he was about to be handed a problem that would change everything. The problem arrived from Dartford in the form of a complaint. Tom Jennings ran Jennings Musical Industries from a factory in Dartford, Kent, and his Vox amplifiers had been gaining ground among British dance band musicians and the emerging skiffle scene throughout the late 1950s. In 1958, Jennings introduced the AC30, a 30-watt, all-valve combo amplifier designed to be loud enough to fill a medium-sized British dance hall without a separate PA system. The AC30 was, by the standards of the time, a powerful amplifier. It was also, by the standards of the time, destroying its own speakers. The G12 loudspeaker that Celestion had been fitting to amplifiers and radiograms was a general-purpose 12-inch driver, 12 inches being the diameter of the cone. Originally developed by British Rolla in the 1930s for radio applications, it was adequate for those applications. It was not adequate for a 30-watt valve amplifier being played at stage volume by a guitarist who wanted to be heard above a drum kit. The voice coil, a cylinder of wire wound around a former, suspended at the center of the cone, converting electrical signal into mechanical movement, was burning out. The surround, The flexible ring of material connecting the outer edge of the cone to the speaker's metal chassis was tearing. The termination wires, which carried the electrical signal from the amplifier terminals to the voice coil, were failing under the physical stress of high-amplitude cone movement. The AC-30 was outrunning its speaker. Every unit that left Dartford was, in a specific and measurable sense, incomplete. Derek Underdown, Vox's technical liaison, brought the problem to Thames Ditton. Les Ward was the man who answered it. Ward's solution was methodical and precise. He made 3 modifications to the existing G12, each one targeting a specific failure mode. First, he reinforced the cone surround, the part tearing under mechanical stress, making it physically stronger without significantly altering its acoustic compliance, the degree to which it allowed the cone to move freely. Second, he replaced the voice coil wire. The existing coil used aluminum wire. Ward changed it to copper. Copper is heavier than aluminum, which slightly increases the moving mass of the assembly, but copper is significantly more tolerant of heat, and heat, generated by electrical resistance at high power levels, was what was destroying the original coils. Third, he strengthened the termination wires, the small conductors most vulnerable to the repeated flexing that occurs when a cone moves at high amplitude for extended periods. The result was the T530. It was rated at 15 watts continuous power handling, the maximum electrical power it could absorb without damage over time. It used an alnico magnet, alnico being an alloy of aluminium, nickel, and cobalt, formed into a short cylinder and positioned at the center of the speaker's magnetic circuit to create the field through which the voice coil moves. Alnico magnets produce a specific magnetic field characteristic, relatively soft at the edges, which means the speaker's response to transient signals, the sharp initial attack of a picked guitar string, is slightly compressed, slightly rounded, in a way that most listeners experience not as a loss of detail, but as warmth, as musicality, as the quality that makes a note feel present rather than merely accurate. Tom Jennings looked at the T530 and made one additional request. He wanted it painted azure blue. The color was a commercial decision, not an acoustic one. Jennings understood that the speaker, visible through the grill cloth of an open-back amplifier, was part of the product's identity. Azure blue, a specific, vivid shade that sat between turquoise and royal blue, was distinctive. It would be recognizable. The speaker was initially badged the Vox Blue and fitted as standard into the AC-15 and the AC-30 twin. It would eventually be known simply as the Alnico Blue. It was, by any defensible measure, the world's first loudspeaker designed specifically for use with an electric guitar amplifier. Now consider what it sounded like. The Alnico Blue's sonic character is specific enough to describe in physical terms: the attack, the initial transient as the cone responds to the first milliseconds of a plucked string, is slightly dampened relative to a speaker with a stiffer surround. The low end is warm without being loose. The cone moves freely enough to reproduce the fundamental frequencies of a guitar's lower strings, but the Alnico magnet's field characteristic means that response never becomes flabby or undefined. The upper mid-range, the frequency range between roughly 1 and 4 kHz, where the human ear is most sensitive, where the perceived presence and character of a guitar tone lives, is what collectors and session musicians most often reach for words to describe. Bell-like is the most common attempt, chiming. The quality of a note that continues to develop after the initial attack, that opens rather than closes, that seems to contain harmonics the amplifier did not obviously produce. That quality was not designed. It was not specified in any document at Thames Ditton. It emerged from the interaction between Ward's specific modifications, Jennings's specified color coding, the Alnico magnet's field geometry, and the acoustic properties of the particular paper cone that Celestion was manufacturing in the late 1950s. It was, in the most literal sense, an accident of British precision, the unintended consequence of solving a specific engineering problem with specific British materials in a specific British factory. What does it mean when the two amplifiers that define the entire polarity of British rock, clean and warm on one side, overdriven and aggressive on the other, contain the same speaker? It means the speaker is not a component. It is the source. Because in 1962, something happened that made the Alnico Blues position even more extraordinary. Jim Marshall, running his drum shop in Hanwell, West London, had spent the previous year listening to guitarists tell him what they wanted from an amplifier. What they described: more volume, more headroom, more of the specific quality of controlled distortion that American amplifiers produced at lower volumes, led Marshall and his technician Ken Brann to build the JTM-45. Marshall's first amplifier, it needed a speaker. The Alnico Blue was Vox's speaker. Jennings had established that relationship, and the azure blue color was part of Vox's visual identity. Marshall could not use it. But Les Ward's factory made more than one version of the toughened G12. The T652 was the silver-framed sibling, acoustically related to the T530, built on the same modified platform, finished in silver rather than blue. Marshall adopted the T652 for the JTM-45, the same Thames Ditton factory, the same Les Ward modifications, a different color, a slightly different tonal character in the upper frequencies, and the beginning of the Marshall sound. Two British amplifier companies, one British speaker factory. The speaker inside the Vox and the speaker inside the Marshall came from the same production line on the same Surrey riverbank. The name on the headstock of every guitar that went through either amplifier was different. The name on the cone behind the grill cloth was the same. The name was Celestion, and almost nobody knew it. By 1963, the Alnico Blue was no longer a speaker that needed explaining. It was a fact of British musical life, present in the amplifiers of every significant guitar-based act working the dance halls, ballrooms, and television studios of the United Kingdom, and increasingly audible on recordings that were beginning to reach beyond Britain entirely. The Shadows had established the template. Hank Marvin's Fender Stratocaster running through a Vox AC30, fitted with Celestion Alnico Blues, had produced, on the 1960 recording of Apache, a sound that British radio listeners had genuinely not encountered before. The tremolo effect, amplitude modulation, the volume of the signal rising and falling at a set rate, built into the AC30's circuit, operated at a specific depth and speed. But it was the speaker that determined how that tremolo resolved into sound. The Alnico Blues' dampened attack and compressed upper mid-range meant that the tremolo did not flutter. It rolled. It produced the quality of unsteadiness that a listener experiences not as instability, but as presence, as if the guitar were in the room rather than on a stage. Apache reached #1 on the UK singles chart in July 1960 and remained there for 8 weeks. It was the best-selling single of 1960 in Britain. Every note of Hank Marvin's lead guitar passed through a Celestion speaker before it reached the air. The Beatles' relationship with the Vox Ace-30, and therefore with the Alnico Blue, was documented from their earliest professional recordings. The AC-30 was their stage amplifier through the period of Please Please Me, with the Beatles, and A Hard Day's Night. John Lennon and George Harrison ran their guitars through AC-30s, fitted with Celestion Blues at the BBC sessions that defined their sound to British radio audiences between 1962 and 1965. The Rolling Stones used Vox amplification in their early recordings. The Kinks recorded You Really Got Me in 1964 through amplifiers that included Vox AC-30s. The Who's early stage setup centered on Vox equipment before Pete Townshend's escalating volume requirements pushed him toward Marshall. And there was the Marshall side of the ledger, which was growing faster than anyone at Thames Ditton had anticipated. The JTM-45 had been followed by successive Marshall designs that demanded more from the speaker. More power handling, more mechanical durability, more ability to resolve the increasingly overdriven signals that British guitarists were feeding into their amplifiers. In late 1964, Celestion began manufacturing ceramic magnet speakers. The Alnico magnet that gave the blue its specific character was expensive, and by the mid-1960s, becoming more so. The global price of the constituent metals, aluminium, nickel, cobalt, was volatile, and cobalt, in particular, was subject to supply pressures that made long-term Alnico production planning difficult. Ceramic magnets, made from an iron-based ferrite compound, were cheaper, more consistent in supply, and capable of producing higher magnetic field strength, which meant greater speaker efficiency, greater sensitivity, more volume from a given wattage of amplifier power. What ceramic magnets could not replicate exactly was the Alnico field geometry, the softer magnetic field at the edges of an Alnico magnet, which produced the blues' characteristic attack compression, was replaced by a harder, more linear field. The result was a speaker with a different sonic personality, less compression on the attack, more aggressive in the upper mid-range, capable of a harder-edged distortion character that, as it turned out, suited the direction British rock music was moving far better than the blues' warm chime. The new speaker was the G12M, medium ceramic magnet, and then the G12H, heavy ceramic magnet. Both were rated for significantly higher power than the 15-watt blue. Both were painted in a green plastic cover over the magnet assembly that gave them their lasting name, Greenback. Not a technical designation, not a Celestion model number. A nickname from the color of the plastic cover over a magnet, and one of the most recognizable words in the vocabulary of British guitar tone. Jim Marshall adopted the Greenback, specifically the Tijuana 1221, the 16-ohm version of the G12M, for his newly introduced 4x12 speaker cabinet in 1965. The 4x12 cabinet, 4 12-inch speakers arranged in a 2x2 grid inside a rectangular enclosure, was itself a Marshall innovation, designed to project sound across the larger venues that British bands were now filling. 4 Greenbacks in a single cabinet, driven by a 100-watt Marshall head, produced a volume and a tonal character that had no precedent in British music. The Greenback's ceramic magnet delivered the efficiency. The G12M's specific cone and voice coil assembly delivered the character. A pronounced mid-range peak in the region of approximately 1.5 to 2.5 kilohertz that gave the amplified guitar a cutting, present quality, the ability to be heard across a large room without being shrilly aggressive, to be loud without being thin. Eric Clapton's recordings with John Mayall's Blues Breakers in 1966, the album that Guitar Player magazine would later describe as the moment British blues guitar reached its definitive statement, were made through a Marshall combo amplifier fitted with a Celestion speaker. The specific warmth of Clapton's tone on those recordings, the way the notes sustain and compress as they decay, is partly a function of the amplifier's valve circuit and partly a function of the speaker resolving that circuit's output. The two are inseparable in the listening experience. They were inseparable in the making of it. By 1967, the Marshall 4x12 cabinet loaded with Celestion Greenbacks was not merely a piece of equipment. It was a visual and sonic standard, the wall of speakers behind a British rock guitarist that signaled seriousness, volume, and a specific kind of intent. Cream used them. The Jeff Beck Group used them. The early Led Zeppelin used them. The Who, by the time Pete Townshend had escalated his stage volume to levels that were physically damaging the venues, were using them in multiples. None of those musicians were endorsing Celestion. None of them were paid to use a Celestion speaker. They used Celestion speakers because the alternative, fitting a different speaker into a Marshall cabinet, produced a result that sounded to their ears, and to the ears of anyone listening, noticeably worse. The market had reached its verdict through the simplest possible mechanism: professional musicians playing in public, in front of audiences whose responses were immediate and unambiguous, chose Celestion and kept choosing it. That is not brand loyalty, that is testimony. In June 1967, the Monterey Pop Festival took place over 3 days in a fairground in Monterey, California. It was the first major American outdoor rock festival, and it was organized, in significant part, around the proposition that the British bands who had spent 4 years remaking American popular music should be seen performing it on American soil, at scale, in front of an American audience that understood what it was witnessing. Jimi Hendrix performed on the final night. Hendrix was, technically, an American, born in Seattle, trained in the American R&B circuit, shaped by the blues traditions of the American South. But by June 1967, he had been living and recording in London for 9 months, and the sound he had developed in that time was specifically, identifiably British in its equipment chain. He played a Fender Stratocaster, American. He ran it through Marshall amplifiers, British. Behind him on the Monterey stage stood 4 Marshall 4x12 speaker cabinets. Each cabinet contained 4 Celestion G12H speakers, 16 Celestion speakers in total, made at the Ferryworks factory on Summer Road, Thames Ditton, Surrey. The label on the back of each cone read, "Made in England." Nobody in the Monterey audience knew what that meant. Every guitarist who subsequently heard the recording of that performance understood exactly what it sounded like. If you had to name the single component present on more significant British rock recordings than any other, the one piece of British manufacturing inside the most important amplifiers of the most important era, what would you guess? A valve? A transformer? A piece of timber? The answer was a paper cone, wound with copper wire, mounted in a steel chassis, painted green on the back, made by women working production lines in a factory beside the Thames in Surrey. 30,000 of them a week. For years. The scale of what Thames Ditton was producing by the early 1970s requires a moment to absorb. In January 1974, Celestion's combined workforce across its 2 operational sites, the original Ferryworks at Thames Ditton and the newer Foxhall Road factory in Ipswich, Suffolk, which had opened in December 1968, reached 907 employees. Some of those employees were working night shifts to meet demand. The Ipswich factory had been built precisely because Thames Ditton had run out of room. The river on one side and the road on the other had made expansion physically impossible, and the demand for Celestion speakers, from Marshall, from Vox, from Selmer, from every other British amplifier manufacturer, and from the hi-fi loudspeaker market that was simultaneously exploding as a separate business, had outgrown the Surrey site's capacity. The Ipswich factory was named Ditton Works, a deliberate act of institutional memory. Thames Ditton's supervisory staff had been sent to Suffolk to train the new Ipswich workforce. The institutional knowledge, the hand skills, the winding tolerances, the feel of a correctly assembled voice coil was carried north by the people who possessed it and passed on in person on the production floor to workers who had no prior experience of loudspeaker manufacture. That transfer of knowledge was neither automatic nor complete. It was human. It was approximate. It was the only method available. At the Thames Ditton factory, in the final years before its closure, there were women on the production line who had been winding voice coils since the early 1950s. 2 decades of a single, precise, repetitive task had given them a tactile knowledge of correct tension, correct alignment, correct termination that could not be written into a specification document and could not be taught in a training course. The copper wire had to be wound to a specific tension, tight enough that the coil would maintain its geometry under the mechanical stress of high-amplitude cone movement, loose enough that the finished coil would not bind against the pole piece at the center of the magnetic assembly. The tolerance was measurable in fractions of a millimeter. The detection of a winding that was outside tolerance was, for an experienced hand, immediate and tactile. A slight resistance in the wire, a minute variation in the weight of the finished coil as it was lifted from the winding former. No machine in 1970 could replicate that detection. No machine was asked to. The women on the Thames Ditton production line were the quality control system, and they were also the production system, and they were also the institutional memory of what a Celestion speaker was supposed to feel like before it was ever played through an amplifier. Their names are not in the historical record. Their winding tolerances are. Every guitarist who has ever described the specific quality of a pre-1970 Thames Ditton Celestion, the pre-Rolla Greenback, in collector terminology, the speakers carrying the label Celestion Limited. Thames Ditton, Surrey, produced before the G12 line transferred to Ipswich in 1970, is, without knowing it, describing the accumulated judgment of those women. The particular compression, the specific mid-range character, the way the speaker resolves an overdriven valve amplifier's output into something that sounds musical rather than merely loud. That quality was not in the specification, it was in the hands. By 1974, 907 people, night shifts, 2 factories, 30,000 units a week at peak. Marshall stacks on stages from the Marquee Club in Wardour Street to Madison Square Garden. Vox AC30s in recording studios from Abbey Road to Olympic Sound. Celestion speakers, Thames Ditton speakers, Ipswich speakers, pre-Rolla speakers, Rolla speakers, Alnico Blues and Silver T652s and Greenbacks and G112-8s inside every significant amplifier in British rock music, and a large proportion of the significant amplifiers beyond it. The name on the outside of the amplifier was Marshall. The name on the outside of the amplifier was Vox. The name on the cone inside was Celestion. And then, in 1975, one of the 2 factories closed. The Thames Ditton closure did not arrive as a shock. It arrived as a conclusion. The decision to build the Ipswich factory in 1968 had been, in part, a recognition that Thames Ditton's geography had made its own expansion impossible. The river and the road were not negotiable. The demand for Celestion speakers was, and so the logical endpoint of opening a second, larger factory in Suffolk was always, eventually, the closure of the smaller, older factory in Surrey. Production of the G12 guitar speaker line had already transferred to Ipswich in 1970. What remained at Thames Ditton after that point was the hi-fi cabinet assembly, the Ditton range of domestic loudspeakers that had become a separate and significant business alongside the guitar speaker operation. By 1974, that too was being absorbed into the Ipswich infrastructure. The Thames Ditton factory was gradually run down through 1974 and into 1975, and closed altogether before the year was out. 907 employees at peak in January 1974, a closure before the end of 1975. What closed with Thames Ditton was not simply a building. It was a specific accumulation of craft knowledge that had been building since 1948. 27 years of institutional memory concentrated in a factory beside the Thames in Surrey. The women who had been winding voice coils since the early 1950s did not transfer to Ipswich. Some retired. Some found other work in the Thames Ditton area. The specific hand knowledge they carried, the winding tension, the tactile quality control, the accumulated judgment of what a correctly assembled Celestion voice coil felt like before it was ever connected to an amplifier, dispersed with them. It did not reconstitute itself in Suffolk. This is Force 4 in its most precise form, not a dramatic factory explosion, not a boardroom betrayal, not a foreign competitor undercutting on price. A quiet dispersal of irreplaceable human skill, accelerated by a rational production decision that made complete sense on a logistics spreadsheet, and could not account for what it was losing. The collector market reached its verdict within a decade. By the early 1980s, guitarists and technicians who had worked with Celestion speakers across the transition period were describing a perceptible difference between pre-1970 Thames Ditton production and post-1970 Ipswich production. The pre-Rolla Greenbacks, identified by the label reading Celestion Limited. Thames Ditton, Surrey, produced between approximately January 1966 and April 1971, were being sought out specifically, pulled from damaged cabinets, reconned if necessary, traded between players who could hear something in them that the later production did not consistently replicate. The difference was not absolute. It was not present in every comparison. But it was present often enough, and described consistently enough by people with sufficient technical knowledge to be credible, that it became a defining characteristic of the collector market that formed around vintage British guitar speakers in the decades that followed. What those collectors were hearing, in all probability, was the accumulated effect of winding tolerances that had been established over 2 decades at Thames Ditton and were slightly less consistent in the Ipswich transition period, not through any failure of effort or intent, but through the simple arithmetic of craft transmission. Knowledge passed from experienced hand to less experienced hand loses something in each transfer. The Thames Ditton closure accelerated that loss by removing the source. Then, in 1979, Les Ward retired. Ward had been chief engineer at Celestion since at least the late 1950s. He had designed the T530 Alnico Blue in 1959. He had overseen the transition to ceramic magnet speakers in the mid-1960s. He had managed the G12 guitar speaker range through its most consequential period, from the first JTM 45 to the Stadium Marshall stacks of the early 1970s. His retirement in 1979 marked the end of a continuous engineering intelligence that had shaped every significant Celestion guitar speaker for 2 decades. The Alnico Blue, the T652, the Greenback G12M, the G12H, all of them bore the imprint of Ward's specific engineering judgment, his knowledge of what a guitar amplifier required from a loudspeaker, his ability to modify a radio speaker into something that the electric guitar could use without destroying. No named successor to Ward's role in guitar speaker development appears in the historical record of this period. What followed his departure was not incompetence. The engineers who remained at Ipswich were skilled and technically capable. But the specific accumulated knowledge of guitar speaker development that Ward represented was, like the Thames Ditton winding tolerances, a form of craft intelligence that does not transfer automatically with a job title. The proof of that assessment arrived 7 years later, in 1986, when Celestion's engineers needed to develop a new guitar speaker to meet the demands of a new generation of high-powered rock amplifiers. Ian White, the project engineer assigned to the task, faced a specific brief. To capture the tonal character of the original 1960s Alnico speakers, the warmth, the compression, the mid-range quality that guitarists and amp manufacturers were by then explicitly describing as the sound they had lost, but in a design using ceramic magnets capable of handling the power levels that 1980s amplifiers required. White solved the problem with a technology that Les Ward had not had access to in 1959, laser Doppler interferometry, an optical measurement technique developed for aerospace and engineering applications, allowed White to analyze the precise cone movement of an original Alnico Blue under signal, mapping the physical behavior of the paper cone across its full frequency range with an accuracy that no listening test could match. The laser could see what Ward had heard. It could measure what Ward had felt in the wire between his fingers on the winding bench. The result was the Vintage 30, launched in 1986. It succeeded. In the 4 decades since its introduction, it has sold more than 2 million units and become, by most measures, the most widely used guitar speaker in the world. By 2026, Celestion was celebrating its 40th anniversary. The Vintage 30 is, without serious argument, a great guitar speaker. It is also the clearest possible evidence of what had been lost. The fact that Ian White needed a laser interferometer in 1986 to reverse engineer what Les Ward had achieved by ear and hand in 1959 is not a criticism of Ian White. It is a precise measurement of the distance between two kinds of knowledge: the accumulated craft intelligence of a man who had spent decades listening to what a loudspeaker could and could not do, and the formal engineering capability of a successor working in an institution that had dismantled the conditions under which that craft intelligence had been built. Les Ward worked by ear, by feel, by the sound coming back from the cone in the ferry works on Summer Road. The laser confirmed what he already knew. The laser was necessary because the man who already knew it was gone. While Les Ward's retirement marked the end of one kind of institutional knowledge, a different kind of institutional logic had been reshaping Celestion's ownership structure for more than a decade before the Vintage 30 was ever conceived. The first structural dislocation had come in 1970. In that year, Celestion, a loudspeaker manufacturer with 907 employees, producing 30,000 speaker units a week, supplying Marshall and Vox and every significant British amplifier maker, was merged with a publicly quoted clothing company. The holding company created by this transaction was named Celestion Industries, plc. The corsetry group involved was the Weingarten Brothers operation, and the merger was structured as a reverse takeover, the clothing company absorbing the loudspeaker manufacturer into a diversified industrial holding structure. Consider that sentence carefully. A company whose products were at that moment inside the amplifiers of Led Zeppelin, Cream, The Who, and effectively every other significant British rock band was merged with a corsetry manufacturer. The logic was financial, not industrial. The holding company structure offered tax efficiencies and balance sheet advantages that had nothing to do with loudspeaker design or guitar speaker development. The managing logic of the new entity was not the logic of craft manufacture. It was the logic of a publicly quoted holding company managing a portfolio of assets toward a financial return. That logic does not ask what a voice coil should feel like when correctly wound. It asks what the return on capital employed by the voice coil production line is and whether a different allocation of that capital would produce a better return. Those are not the same question. They have never produced the same answer. The second dislocation came in 1979, when the holding company adopted the name Celestion International, reflecting, as the company's own communications noted, the increasingly international nature of its business. Overseas subsidiaries had been established in France in September 1976, in West Germany in October 1976, and in the United States in February 1977. The name change was accurate as a description of geographic reach. It was also a signal of strategic orientation. Celestion was no longer primarily a British manufacturer serving the British market and exporting the surplus. It was an international business that happened to manufacture in Britain. The distinction matters. A British manufacturer defines its quality by what it can make. An international business defines its quality by what the market will accept. Those two definitions can produce the same product for a long time. They do not produce the same product forever. What is a British speaker brand when the ownership is in Hong Kong and the production is in China? The third and definitive dislocation came in 1992. Kinergetics Holdings, a UK-registered holding company whose majority shareholder was Gold Peak Industries of Hong Kong, a conglomerate with annual revenues exceeding $1 billion, operating across electronics, batteries, and consumer goods, acquired Celestion International in a transaction that simultaneously acquired KEF, the Maidstone-based British loudspeaker company whose BBC LS35A monitor work had made it one of the most technically respected names in domestic hi-fi. Two British loudspeaker companies, two of the most significant names in British audio manufacturing, passing to the same Hong Kong holding company in a single transaction. The board meetings that produced this outcome are not in the public record. What is in the public record is the consequence. Gold Peak invested in research and development at the Ipswich facility through the 1990s. The finite element analysis capability established in 1992, the continued work in compression drivers, the neodymium magnet technology development that expanded Celestion's professional audio range. Those investments were real. They produced genuine technical advances. The Celestion of the 1990s and early 2000s was not a hollowed-out brand coasting on a historic name, but the guitar speaker production that had been the company's defining contribution to British musical culture, the production that had put Celestion inside the Vox AC30 and the Marshall stack simultaneously, that had placed a Thames Ditton voice coil at the center of virtually every significant British rock recording of the 1960s and 1970s, was contracting. The Vintage 30, which had become Celestion's most commercially successful guitar speaker since its 1986 launch, transferred to Chinese production around 2002. The premium lines, the Alnico Blue reissue, the Alnico Gold, remained in Ipswich. The volume production did not. The Vauxhall Road factory in Ipswich, which had opened in December 1968 as the purpose-built successor to Thames Ditton, which had been named Ditton Works in deliberate homage to the Surrey factory it was designed to replace, which had employed hundreds of Suffolk workers through the 1970s and into the 1980s, was eventually abandoned after the 1992 acquisition. Manufacturing wound down. The site sat unused, a warehouse and a set of offices maintaining a token presence. The neighboring Bull Motors site closed in 2000. Then both sites were demolished. A housing estate was built on the land. The developers, in an acknowledgement that might have been intended as respectful and reads, in retrospect, as something considerably more complicated, named one of the new roads Celestion Drive. The last batch shipped from Vauxhall Road in the quiet. The machinery fell silent. The winding benches were cleared. The copper wire was gone. The cone paper was gone. The women who knew the tension of a correctly wound voice coil were long gone. What remained was a name, a brand, a street sign in a Suffolk housing estate, and the sound, still in the speakers, still in the amplifiers, still audible on recordings made in a Surrey factory that had been rubble for decades. The sound did not care who owned the company. The sound did not know what country the factory was in. The sound was already out there. It had been out there since 1959, and it was not coming back. What survived the Vauxhall Road demolition, the Gold Peak acquisition, and the transfer of mass production to China is a more complicated answer than a simple yes or no. The Celestion name is still on speakers made in Ipswich, Suffolk. The Alnico Blue, the direct descendant of Les Ward's T530, built to the same Alnico magnet specification, wound with copper voice coil wire, painted the same azure blue that Tom Jennings requested in 1959, is still manufactured in England. The Alnico Gold, a higher-powered variant developed for players who want the Alnico character with greater headroom, is also made in Ipswich. For those specific products, the claim of British manufacture is legitimate and unambiguous. The premium guitar speaker lines remained in Suffolk when the volume production left. But the Vintage 30, the speaker that Ian White designed in 1986, that has sold more than 2 million units in 4 decades, that is the standard fit speaker in more guitar amplifiers than any other single model currently in production, has been manufactured in China since approximately 2002. The G12M Greenback reissue is manufactured in China. The G12OH Anniversary is manufactured in China. Gold Peak Industries of Hong Kong, operating through GP Acoustics UK, owns the company that makes all of them. The collector market has rendered its verdict on this arrangement in the clearest possible language: money. On Reverb, Com, and eBay. The market for original Thames Ditton Celestion speakers, the pre-Rolla Greenbacks carrying the label Celestion Limited. Thames Ditton, Surrey, the Alnico Blues pulled from early 1960s Vox A30s, the silver T652s from the first Marshall JTM45 cabinets, operates at prices that have no rational relationship to the cost of a current production replacement. Original Thames Ditton examples in working condition command premiums over current reissue production that the reissues cannot justify on specification alone. Collector terminology has developed its own precise vocabulary for this market: pre-Rolla, Rolla era, blackback, grayback. The specific label variations that identify production date and factory location to within a year or two. A guitarist searching for a pre-Rolla Thames Ditton Greenback is not searching for a loudspeaker. They are searching for a specific accumulation of craft decisions made at a specific address between specific years by people whose names are not in the catalog. What those collectors are paying for, above and beyond the reissue price, is the unverifiable but persistently reported quality difference that experienced players describe when comparing original Thames Ditton production to everything that followed it. The compression, the mid-range character, the way an overdriven valve amplifier's output resolves through a pre-Rolla cone into something that sounds musical in a way that is difficult to specify and immediately apparent to anyone who has played through both, whether that difference is real in any measurable acoustic sense or whether it is the product of decades of accumulated mythology and the human tendency to hear what we expect to hear, is a question that the collector market has decided it does not need to answer. The prices are the answer. The prices say, something was made at Thames Ditton that has not been consistently replicated since. The specific functional reason the original cannot be replaced is not abstract. A Vox AC30 from the early 1960s, fitted with its original Celestion Alnico Blue speakers, produces a breakup characteristic at moderate volumes, the quality of controlled distortion as the amplifier is pushed toward its power limit, that interacts with the speaker's Alnico compression in a way that the current reissue Blue approaches, but does not fully replicate. Session guitarists in London still seek out original specification AC30s for specific recording applications. The reason is not nostalgia. The reason is that the sound of a specific copper voice coil wound to a specific tension in a specific Surrey factory, interacting with a specific Alnico magnetic field, producing a specific cone movement that resolves a specific valve amplifier's output. That combination of specificities has not been industrially reproduced with complete consistency. It may not be reproducible. Craft knowledge that dispersed in 1975 does not reconstitute itself from a specification document. Now consider the surprise. When Ian White sat down in 1986 to develop the Vintage 30, he had access to technology that Les Ward had never seen. Laser Doppler interferometry, an optical measurement system that uses the Doppler shift of reflected laser light to map the velocity of a vibrating surface at thousands of points simultaneously, allowed White to analyze the cone movement of an original Alnico Blue in complete physical detail, every mode of vibration, every resonance, every frequency at which the paper cone moved in ways that the voice coil had not directly driven it to move, the so-called breakup modes that produce the harmonic complexity listeners describe as character, as warmth, as the quality that makes a speaker sound musical rather than merely accurate. The laser could measure all of it. It produced a precise physical model of what Les Ward had built in 1959 by ear and by hand, in a factory without a laser interferometer, without finite element analysis software, without any measurement tool more sophisticated than his own, listening, and the tactile feedback of wire under his fingers on a winding bench. The laser confirmed what Les Ward already knew. He had known it since 1959. He knew it because he had listened, because he had wound the coil himself and heard the result and adjusted the tension and heard the result again, because the knowledge was in his hands before it was ever in a measurement, because that is what craft is, the embodiment of accumulated judgment in a physical act, repeated until the judgment and the act are no longer separable. What is left of that knowledge now stands at a smaller facility in Claydon, near Ipswich, research, administration. The premium guitar speaker lines that Celestion still manufactures in England. The Foxhall Road site is a housing estate. The ferry works at Thames Ditton, where Les Ward modified the first T530 in 1959, where 30,000 speaker cones a week were produced at peak, where the women whose names are not in the record wound, the voice coils that defined the sound of British rock. That site was cleared long before Foxhall Road. The river is still there. Summer Road is still there. The factory is not. And the sound, the specific frequency signature of a British speaker cone made in a Surrey factory that no longer exists, is that sound still British? Does a sound belong to the place that first made it, regardless of who owns the company now? Celestion's story does not answer that question. It insists on it. A company founded in Hampton Wick in 1924 made something so specific, so precisely matched to what the electric guitar required from a loudspeaker, that it became the hidden constant of an entire musical era, present inside both defining amplifiers, audible on both sides of the polarity that British rock established. The ownership changed. The geography changed. The factory became a housing estate, and the housing estate got a road named after what had stood there, and somewhere in a rehearsal room in London, or a recording studio in Manchester, or a guitarist's bedroom in Leeds, an original Alnico blue sits in the baffle of an early Vox A30, still wound with copper wire to the tension Les Ward specified, still carrying the Alnico magnet whose field geometry produces that specific dampened attack, that specific compressed chime. And when the amplifier is switched on and the guitar is played, the cone moves exactly as it moved the first time anyone pushed it in 1961. The factory on Summer Road is gone. The women who wound the coils are gone. Les Ward is gone. The Surrey riverbank that produced the sound has been built over and built over again. The sound is still here. It was always going to outlast the building.